Good evening, everybody. My name is Kyle Lim. I'm a member of the Education Justice team here with UCC. Just to give you a sense before we jump into things about what today's going to look like, I want to give, for those of you that are not familiar with UCC, a little overview of who we are and what we do. UCC is a racial justice organization that is committed to making systems, particularly public systems, more open and accessible and participatory for all communities, but particularly for marginalized communities of color. So in our education justice work, our priority is around public schools, particularly for the past couple of years. We've been focusing in on the Grand Rapids public schools. And one of the things that has been a huge priority for us has been talking about school budgets, because decisions are being made about money that speaks to our values and speaks to the things that we find are our priority. And so that's one of the reasons why we're going to be talking a little bit about budgets today. Why are we taking a step back and talking about budgets 101? One of the things that we've heard recently in the listening sessions that we've done through March and April is that many people feel confused about budgets. We're not sure what to expect. They feel really confusing and intimidating. There's a lot of language that perhaps we didn't understand. So we wanted to take this time, take a step back, and kind of unpack some of that so people feel well prepared to enter into the conversations that we want them to be able to have with their elected leaders and district leadership. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. We're going to take a little bit of time to unpack some definitions and terms as they relate to budgets. We'll take a little bit of time talking about the education funding context of Michigan. It's important for us to know what's come before and some of the parameters that a lot of districts are having to make decisions within and some of the forces that are at play as we think about our organizing work. We're going to talk about the process of a public education budget coming into being, who is responsible for that, the decision makers you see there, but also what's the timeline for that, and then some of the organizing opportunities that are connected to that. Then we're going to talk really briefly about, I'm going to pull up the GRPS, Grand Rapids Public Schools budget, walk us through how we can access that, give people a little sense of what they can anticipate at the upcoming budget hearings, which are happening next week already, June 10th on Monday at 5:30 p.m. at Franklin campus. And the vote for the following school year's budget will be the following week, June 17th, also at Franklin campus, but at 6:30 p.m. And we'll have that in the slides coming up. Then last, but certainly not least, we're going to talk about some of what our goals are. And when we talk about our goals, we're not just talking about UCC's organizational goals, although we do believe in these, but these goals have been created through the participation of many community members, students, parents, staff members, as we've gone about our organizing work. So we like to call these community budget goals, and we believe that some of these investments will bring about significant net investments, net benefits for all our students, but particularly for marginalized students of color. I threw this little slide in there because this is the look that I do when I know I look at a lot of budget documents. And when I've looked around the room at folks, I've seen this too. And a lot of people that we talk to say, you know what, when I look at a budget, it's so intimidating. I don't know what people are talking about. I don't know what, I see all these tables and numbers and words and lines, and it's just confusing. And we're here to tell you that yes, budgets are intimidating, but also they're made to be intimidating. And there's a reason behind why we think that budgets are so important. They're inaccessible at times for a reason. And we believe that part of that reason is they really were not made for public participation. They were made for quick decision making for a few folks, and that's just not the way we want to do business anymore. So we really believe that budgets should be accessible, they should be transparent, they should be clear and easy to understand for folks, and that's part of the work that we're doing. In the meantime, before we get to that state, we're going to lean into this process and tell ourselves that we can do hard things, and even when something feels big and clunky, that we can take it on and figure it out. So this next little bit is going to be a little bit, more, there's going to be more words. I'm going to be talking about definitions and stuff like that. So stick with it. If you're already familiar with this stuff and you're watching this on repeat, you can always skip ahead. But I'm just going to do a real brief breakdown of some common terms that we hear when we think about budgets. So first, when we talk about a budget, we're talking about a plan. And really, that plan is around how much money you are able to spend based on the money that you know that you have coming in, right? So how much money I plan to be able to spend based on the money I know coming in. It's really pretty straightforward. When we hear people talk about revenue, what they're really talking about is how much money you got coming in. So another word for that is income. In budget terms, we often talk about revenue versus expenses. So revenue is the money you got coming in, and a revenue stream is where that money is coming from. So you might hear me say later that public schools in Michigan have a few different revenue streams. The state, they get some money from the federal government, they get some money from local taxes. So there's different revenue streams, and you might have different revenue streams. Maybe you work a day job, right? And then you have an evening hustle, or maybe you drive Uber or something like that. So you might have different revenue streams. So a revenue stream is basically where your money's coming from. Projections are what you're thinking something's going to cost. It's either what you think something's going to cost, and sometimes we call that an estimate, or it's also a projection if you're trying to figure out how much money you got coming in. And we'll talk about how that's a difficult process for a lot of public schools because of the timing of the legislature and how local school districts are having to make decisions. I already talked about this briefly, but expenditures or expenses are all the things that you're going to be spending your money on. So for public schools, that's a lot of those are salaries, but you're also thinking about curriculum. Maybe you're thinking about a contract for your bus service. All those kinds of things count as expenditures or expenses in a school budget. There's also categoricals, which means certain buckets, certain money that comes in can only be spent for certain things. And this can be a little bit tricky. And we hear this a lot, like, oh, we can't actually use our money for that because some of the money that's coming in, particularly from federal and state sources, are designated towards certain things, and districts can only spend their money on those things. But we'll talk about the nuance of that a little bit later. And then you might hear about a budget amendment. And that's a formal process that in our case, the school board has to go through to change the plan based on updates that they're receiving on revenue, right? Maybe they're getting more money than they anticipated, or updates to expenses. Maybe things are costing more, or maybe they might be costing less and they're saving money. So an amendment is when they make a change to that plan. And for the sake of public schools, that's always a formal process. I should say, if I haven't already, that we're gonna sort of end the presentation portion at 6:15 and take the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have questions for us or questions are coming up for you around school budgets, feel free to drop them. Drop a comment in the live stream, and my colleague Saida is gonna be collecting those, and we'll take some time at the end to go through those at 6:15. All right. So those are some of the common terms and definitions when we hear about budgets. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like for schools shortly. But before we do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some context-specific information for Michigan public schools. So one important thing for us to recognize, I don't know, this looks funny on my screen. There we go. is that school funding for Michigan, so all public schools receive most of their money based on how many students they have enrolled in their district. So a common perception is that schools are funded by property taxes. That has historically and for many places been the case. In 1994, Michigan legislature adopted what was called Proposal A, and that shifted that property tax funding formula to a different funding formula based on sales and income tax. So a big thing here is to note that, and we'll revisit this shortly, is that districts receive most of their money based on how many students they have enrolled in their school or in their district. And that's sometimes called a foundation allowance or per pupil funding. Again, that foundation allowance comprises of state and local taxes, and it's mostly used for general operating costs, so paying teachers, buying curriculum. They can really use that however they see fit. The remaining of that revenue comes from state and federal sources. So some of the primary revenue sources are state categorical grants. I mentioned categoricals are things that the district has to spend that money on. So the state will give the district some money for things maybe like teacher development or something like that. And they can only spend the money on those things. Special ed funding also comes on top. There's a different kind of foundation allowance for special ed. And that funding also comes through the state and some through the federal government. This is a big chunk of money, is what we call title dollars. So Title I funding is usually used to support at-risk students, and that comes from the federal government. So on top of your foundation allowance, you'll get a added sort of formula to that amount based on the student's eligibility as at-risk or not. Title II funding is dedicated funding for, again, for teachers and staff, and that also comes from the federal government. And then another funny one is the school lunch program. So schools, public schools actually get reimbursed through the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, for giving out their lunches. The reimbursal is not very much, but that does count as a revenue stream for public school districts. So you'll see that particularly in the special revenue section of a budget, school budget. And lastly, a little bit of a funky thing just for Michigan is that school facilities are funded through local millages. So we recently passed a no tax increase millage this past fall for GRPS, where the city of Grand Rapids, the residents voted in favor of continuing the current millage rates. And that money that's collected through our tax dollars goes specifically towards facilities. So this is another example of we raised, all this money through that millage, but we can only spend that money on facilities related things. It's also important to talk about historical context. This slide comes from our friends at the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, and it shows that over the last 20 years, our Michigan legislature really has divested from public schools. So you'll see here total recurring education revenue. That's how much money the state is bringing in to fund education stuff. And that's continuously dropping over the past 20 years. A similar revenue, total education expenses, how much money we're spending on education related services, has been decreasing. So while we went from one of the a state in the 90s and 80s that had that was very well funded, and we still had disparities, but there was a robust kind of funding system. That really has not been the case for the past 20 years. The implications of this is that many public school districts, particularly large urban public school districts, are being asked to do a lot with very little resources. So that it is a tall ask for a lot of our public schools and their leadership to be able to do all that they need to be able to do with quite limited funding. So with that, it's really, really important for us to be advocating, not just on the local level for what we want our leadership to spend money on, but at the legislative level. So we need to really be pushing our legislators to rethink the funding formula for Michigan schools. Currently, it's not working. Most public schools, or annually across Michigan, we still, a study showed that we're about $4 billion short on being able to provide adequate services to our schools. We do this advocacy work in conjunction with the Michigan Education Justice Coalition. We're going to drop the link to their website on the live stream. They're a great way for us to work with other organizations across the state interested in education justice to come together and push our legislature to fund our schools. You can participate in that with us. You know, we have lobby days. We recently just finished our lobby day for this year, but we consistently are in Lansing trying to push our legislatures. And we've seen some successes in the last couple of years. We've had the highest foundation allowance rate or amount per student that we've had in decades. So there is a willingness in Lansing right now to invest in public education, and we need to keep that pressure up. So what are some of the implications around how we need to think about how our schools are funded? The first is really to talk about school choice, competition, and count day. Essentially, what we are saying is that because of the way that funding is set up in Michigan, it's a per pupil thing, and that the state legislation in the past 30 years or so has really invested in this idea of schools choice. So we see a lot of charter school systems and stuff like that. We've essentially created an educational environment where districts, public and charter, are competing for students, right? If how much money you get is based on how many students you have enrolled in your district or your charter school, you're going to be working really hard to try to recruit students. And so that it's for some districts, I'll use East Grand Rapids as an example. That's a great space. They're not going to be looking for a whole bunch of other options. Most folks are just going to send their kids to the local public school. But if you look at a landscape like Grand Rapids, where there's so many charter and private systems, it becomes a really, really hard space for public schools, like I said, that are already being tasked to do a lot with minimal resources, to have to compete in that landscape. So it creates a really toxic environment for how schools have to function. One of the ways we've seen that happen in GRPS is the proliferation of theme schools, right? So theme schools and the creation of theme schools was really an attempt to recruit and retain students in the district. And that is a great idea in concept, but unfortunately, the effect that we've had is that it's come at the expense and the cost of many of our neighborhood schools, and for students and families that don't have as much of an option or a choice in where they're able to send their kids. So one of the implications around the school funding landscape in Michigan is this idea of school choice and competition. And lastly, it's also why count day becomes such a big deal for each district, because twice a year in October and February, they have to count up all the students they have in their schools and send that into the state in order to receive the funding for each student. So it becomes a really, really tricky thing around that notion of counting. I mentioned earlier, and we walked through this, public schools are historically underfunded. So it is important for us to remember that and to have our work be targeted at both the state and the local level. And I mentioned this also, there are some restrictions on how some revenue can be used. However, those are often open to interpretation. And the person that's often doing that interpretation is the school district chief finance officer or their finance officer. This person has a lot of power through their drafting and creation of the budget to determine what they feel like is feasible, what they feel like is too risky, what they want the fund balance or what's left over in the district to look like, All of those things are pretty subjective decisions that are being made. Of course, not alone, but primarily by this chief finance officer. And so really one of the things that we would love to see in Grand Rapids Public Schools is a chief finance officer that's willing to be proactive, take risks. Often this is a pretty conservative approach where they like to hold on to their money rather than spend it on the necessary things. And lastly, an implication for us is that school boards are really critical because they are the ones that approve the budgets every year, actually coming up on June 17th. And we'll come back to this in just a second. So I really wanted to hit on this idea, these two last points, that the district chief finance officer, in our case, Ms. Rhonda Cribbs for GRPS, and school board members have a lot of power. They're the ones who draft the budget and approve. The chief finance officer drafts the budget and school boards approve the budget. Who are these people? A lot of folks that we talk to don't even know. So we wanted to introduce y'all to who these folks are, put a face to a name, and also walk you through how they go about making those decisions. So the school budget decision makers are, like I mentioned, Ms. Rhonda Cribbs. She's the chief finance officer. Of course, she works with a team, and the ultimate decision maker within the district is the superintendent, who is Dr. Lidrian Roby. The school board, these 9 faces that you see over here, they're a 9-person elected school board, and they vote to approve the budget every year in June. There's also a finance committee comprised of board members. Once the budget has been created, there's a lot of wiggle room for how that money gets spent. And it's often the finance committee that talks about those significant expenditures. So an example recently was there was a decision that went through the finance committee first on whether or not the district wanted to renew an Elevate K-12, which is a virtual teacher contract for the following year. It went through finance committee before it came up to the board, where they voted. The board actually voted in their purchasing agenda to approve the contract for the following year with this virtual teacher company, despite quite a bit of community pushback. So that's an example that goes through a process of the finance committee to the board. And then once the board has created the budget, they're able to make these large purchases, these significant purchases with the money that they've allocated there. What's the budget process? Let's go through it as a timeline because this is helpful. Every year in February, from February to April, district department heads, this includes building principals, are starting to make budgets for their programs. So that could be for your individual school. It could be for, the professional development office, family and community engagement. All of these communications, all of these different departments are beginning to create their budgets, what they think they're going to be spending particularly for the upcoming year. This is an important moment in time because this is when things could be inserted into those, right? Ideas, things that we want to see in our schools, ideas or programs perhaps at the school level or even ideas at the district level. Some of that planning and cost estimation, all of that stuff can be happening during this time frame. In May, the state legislature shares their preliminary budget projection. So this is how much money they think they're going to be giving to local school districts. In June, in this case, this year on June 10th, the CFO presents the budget to the school board and there's a discussion there. Public, of course, is welcome to attend. You can offer comment, but there's not usually typically a public Q&A process around the budget. We would love to see something like that, but the district hasn't taken it upon themselves to do that quite yet. And then after the budget hearing, the school board actually votes on the budget to approve the district budget for the following school year. So we'd be looking at approving a budget for the 24-25 school year. It has to be, the budget has to be approved by the end of June. So they don't have to approve it at that meeting, but if they don't, they have a very small window to be able to approve it, which is before the end of June. In September, the state releases their final education budget, and we'll talk about the complexity of that shortly. And just to note that there's usually two key budget amendments that are tied to count day. So count day tells the schools how much money they're going to get for the students that are enrolled. It's a weighted thing, so more in the fall versus the spring. And oftentimes the district will do a budget amendment based on what they know now, how much money they're going to get after count day. So some process points that we should be paying attention to. One thing, like one hot topic right now is around increasing teacher pay. However, some aspects are not renewed every year, particularly collective bargaining agreements and critical service contracts. So collective bargaining agreements could be like the teachers union. They, for example, signed a 3-year contract that runs, I believe, through 2025. And even though they're wanting an increase in pay now because of all the extenuating circumstances around us, cost of living is going up, all that kind of stuff, they're one of the lowest paid districts in the county right now. We're losing staff. So despite the fact that the teacher union is asking the district to renegotiate around this, the district is not required to, because they have a binding contract that allows them to keep the current pay rate through the end of the contract term. Similarly, with other long-term critical service contracts, like with Dean Transportation, we're coming to the end of a 5-year contract with them. Some of these are long-term things. So it's important for us to be paying attention to when those windows are. I also talked briefly about the complexity of state education budgets versus district budgets. So districts are required to submit a budget in June, but the state of Michigan, while they give them projections in May, don't finalize their budget until September usually, and sometimes it can be even longer than that. So it does create a lot of stress for schools to have to be able to anticipate how much money that they're going to get, but this is around the foundation allowance, so it's their biggest revenue source, and they don't know exactly how much money they're going to get around this biggest revenue source from year to year. So it is a bit of a precarious position, and sometimes that pushes a spirit of conservatism, right? We don't want to outspend what we don't really know, but we are in crisis. And we need some bold and courageous decision making at that level to push us out of it. Lastly, I want to bring attention to the legislature and the education committee. I already mentioned they are the ones who determine what the finalized foundation allowance per pupil amount is going to be. So it is really, really important, while we are working hard to hold our local districts accountable to investing in things that are critical to our students and our staff and our families. It's also important for us to be thinking about that. It's very hard for them to do the job that they need to do when they don't have enough money coming from the state. Some call outs that I just want to bring attention to. The budget hearing and vote in June. It's a really important moment where our electeds, right, the people that we vote for, are making a key decision about the future of our schools. It's really, really important that those people know the things that we want them to be investing in well ahead of time. And that makes kind of that prior planning and some of our organizing work really, really important. For this year, we sent our budget recommendations to our school board members already in December of last year. So giving them plenty of time to be able to be involved in the process, but also to be thinking about how that can influence their decision making. Budget amendments are great opportunities to organize around, because they're moments when they're already opening up the plan, right? If they're already opening up the plan to think about including or switching up some stuff, that's a great opportunity for us to be able to get some of the stuff that we'd like to see invested in, covered in that as well. And lastly, our count days are really important too, because these are the days that the district determines how much money that they receive. However, there are also points of leverage for community members as we think about how we can push the district around needing to be accountable in meeting the basic needs of students. And lastly, I mentioned the importance of school boards. That's an election year this year. There are going to be seats up on our school board. And it's really, really important that candidates know what we want folks to be investing in. So reach out to folks that you know are planning to run to office. We'll also drop a link to the county election site where you can see after the end of July, all school board candidates will have to have filed that they're planning to run for office, and you can be able to access their link or their information there. All right, we're gonna transition just really quickly to give you a bit of a flavor of what GRPS or what you can expect to see when looking at some of the GRPS information. We're also dropping a really helpful slide link to a really helpful slide deck created actually by our Chief Finance Officer that tells us some of the breakdown of different categories like the special revenue fund, the general fund, debt service fund, stuff like that. So we'll include the link to that. I'm not going to cover all of that, but just know that that resource is available to you in the comments. I want to show you how you can, first of all, access the school budget information. Michigan requires all districts to be able to make their financial information available to the public. So this is the GRPS landing page, their main website. And on it, you'll see this little window pop up that has the Michigan State outline on it. And if you click on that window, it says transparency and reporting. It'll automatically direct you to budget and salary reporting page. And you can see it's a transparency page. And you can see all kinds of stuff on this page if you're interested to go digging. The first is, of course, previous year's budgets and the current operating budget that has been adopted for this year. You can see personal expenditures, look through people's bargaining agreements, such as the teachers union contract, all kinds of that. So all of that's available to you, but we're going to stick with budgets for right now. So if you click on this budget, this is what you can expect to see if you come to the budget hearing next week. It'll probably say a draft here instead of adopted or something like that. But it's going to be very similar to what you see here. Something that we like to pay attention to is amount of different revenue streams. Are those things that feel way different than we've seen previously? A really interesting example of this was in the aftermath of COVID, we had a lot of emergency relief funds. So suddenly some of our revenue streams looked really, really different. And we suddenly looked like we had a lot of money. And that's a whole nother conversation about how we try to help the district make some decisions around using ESSER funds. But just to point you to show you some of the things that you might find familiar. Expenditures, these are all the things that the school is spending money on. The general fund budget is a great point of reference. This is how much money is left in the school's bank account, the district's bank account, basically from year to year. The board tries to keep right around a 5 to 15, anywhere in the range of a 5 to 15% fund balance. It can go as low as 5%. If it goes under 5%, there is a threat of a state takeover, though not immediate. So there is some element. Last year, I remember the fund balance was sitting right around 17%. So we had a lot of money that we could have been able to be spending down, but instead we're choosing to sit it in the bank. Special revenue, so you'll see in here things like food service. This is what you get from the federal lunch program, reimbursement and stuff like that. So this is where you'd be able to access that information. At the budget hearing, you'll probably see something like this. It doesn't give you all the breakdown that you need, but if you're really into the details, you can kind of scroll down and begin to see a little bit more around like what percent of the budget was around salaries, and they break it down by elementary and secondary and stuff like that. So lots of interesting information in here. Again, they're created in ways that often feel pretty inaccessible to the public. If you feel like it's too much for you, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we can sit down and try to make sense of it together. I'm by no means an expert, but we'll do our best. In our last few minutes before we move to Q&A, I want to talk really quickly about some of our budget goals. And I mentioned already the process by which we went through to source some of these was working with really the folks that we organize with. So these are students, parents, staff members, who have all been a part of kind of creating this vision for what we like to call healthy and healing schools. But some of the things that we're really pushing for this year, and this is for the 24-25 school year, is to increase teacher pay. We are in a critical moment. We are losing teachers. There's well over 200 shortages across the district right now. And there's no real incentive for aspiring educators to come and work for our district when compensation is low. The scale that they move through is not very good. So there's a lot of room for improvement around teacher pay. As I mentioned, it's not a bargaining year around teacher pay contract. And we were really trying to urge our electeds to say, y'all need to do something about this, because otherwise we're going to continue to lose teachers to surrounding districts. We also need to create access points to benefits for like non-district level staff, even if particularly when they're filling these critical staff positions. So examples of these are parapros, bus drivers, some food service folks, and subs. These are folks that are being asked to work for pretty low wages and without access to health benefits, or perhaps only single payer coverage, right? So their families don't have access to benefits. And that we know how much medical costs, retirement benefits, like we're living in a space of increasing precarity for workers. We really want our school district to say, you know what, we will take care of you. You deserve this if you're working for the district, or even if you're working for Dean Transportation or Edu staff. If that's a GRPS contract, we want to give you access to some of these things. And lastly, and this is more with the bond dollars, millage dollars that we raised this recently, we're hearing from students the need to improve food service. One of the big things that they would love to see is the ability to do scratch cooking in their own schools. And most schools' kitchens are simply set up for warming. They're not really set up for learning, for experimental use for students, nor are they made to be able to cook fresh food. So that's something we're really hoping the district will invest in with those millage dollars. In terms of long-term budget goals, we believe that the board should be working towards creating multi-year long-term plans to repair some of the divestment we've seen in frontline staff. Teachers are chronically underpaid. Most school, unless you work at Franklin campus and kind of have a high-paying job or like a top administrative job, working for the district is pretty low pay. They count on their benefits, but increasingly, as we've outsourced so many of our services to other companies, many workers right now do not have access to a living wage and commensurate benefits. We want the district to be able to make long-term plans with the money that you know you're going to be having, the projections, to be able to say, what does it take for us to say that we're going to put people first, our people first, pay them a good wage, and we can see then, we know that that's going to have a better effect on our students. And we also want to create more transparent budgeting processes, right? Families and students should be involved at the budgeting process, budgeting process. Frontline staff also. And the district needs to think of ways that they can involve community members and some of these other building level and frontline staff in budget decision making. At the state level, we really would love for us to be thinking about reformulating the current funding formula for Michigan schools. Some ideas that we have is the idea of a progressive income tax. The more money you make, the more tax you pay, and that money goes towards our schools. There's also been a real lack of willingness for our legislatures to increase corporate taxes, even from the Democrats. We know that Amazon pays less taxes than some of our everyday Michigan citizens. And that's not fair. And they should be contributing to our educational landscape if they're choosing to do business here. So that's a wrap on the presentation end of things. Some quick things that we have coming up. If you're able to scan that link tree or that QR code, you should bring you straight to our link tree. Saida is also going to drop that in the comments so that you can click on it. It's a great way to get connected to us. It'll also point you towards a lot of the work that we've done this past year and in years past. You can see our budget recommendations. I should have given a shout out to our students. They were at the board meeting en masse on Monday in solidarity with teachers asking for teacher increases in teacher pay. You can see the student demands. Those are also on the link tree. But there's also some exciting stuff coming up. June 10, as I've been mentioning a few times, this is next Monday at 5:30 p.m. at Franklin campus, 1331 MLK Junior Street, or Franklin, is going to be the budget hearing. So this is when Ms. Rhonda Cripps, CFO, is going to be talking to the board and the public and the community about their plan for the next year. So if you're interested in that conversation, please come out on the 10th. You'll be able to see us there. The following week, so 2 Mondays from now, the board will be voting on the proposed budget. So that doesn't guarantee that it'll go through, but also a really, really interesting thing to pay attention to, particularly as we go into election season. We want to be keeping track of the ways in which our elected officials are voting for things that are important to us. We also want y'all to stay tuned. We have got some exciting stuff coming up. UCC will be releasing a voter guide this year, not just for school board candidates, but all city and county races. So candidates will be responding to a questionnaire, and you'll be able to see some of their responses in there to give you a sense of how you feel about them. And lastly, we'll also be doing in October, likely some we will be doing school board candidate forums, specifically for Grand Rapids Public Schools, school board candidates, those that are wanting to run for office and will have their names on the ballot this coming November. All right, I'm going to shift over to some Q&A and see if we have any questions coming up so far. In the meantime, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Give me one moment while I pull up my document. I am seeing a question from Seth. How much is our GRPS balance now as a percentage in that fund? Seth, I'm not sure off the top of my head. What I think I mean you saying is how much is the GRPS fund balance as a percentage of the general fund? A simple answer for me right now is I'm not sure. The information I'm working off of is from the previous school year. We haven't received that information yet this year. That'll be presented at the budget hearing on the 10th. Other than that, we don't have any other questions. Again, if you'd like to reach out to us, please scan or click on the link to the link tree. We'd love to talk to you if you have questions or just want to have a little bit more in-depth conversation about school budgets. We'd love to be able to do that. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next Monday.